you, Doa. I would just like to thank Doa, Birgel, and Ben for inviting us to participate in the Highway to Science workshop. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. So in recent years, the rapid proliferation of digital data in Near Eastern archaeology has created an unprecedented opportunity to create collaborative research initiatives with the capacity to investigate complex questions such as the long-term impacts of climate change and anthropogenic activity at finely grained and localized scale of analysis within discrete subregions of the ancient Near East. The computational research on the ancient Near East, or CRANE project, funded primarily by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, is a multidisciplinary consortium of archaeologists, climate, paleoenvironmental, and computer scientists that seek to facilitate such a collaborative research environment. In what we are now referring to as CRANE 1.0, we focused on the Orontes watershed as an initial operational test case. The success of this original partnership has positioned us for CRANE 2.0, a project composed of multiple sub-projects which pursue more systematic investigations of the complex interplay between human communities and their environment in the Eastern Mediterranean and the broader Middle East. Initially, CRANE focused on the integration of digital data from multiple archaeological research projects that use different terminologies and come from different research traditions. The aim was to create a core culture and paleoenvironmental sequence for the region. CRANE 1.0 addressed these objectives through a focus on archaeological projects in the Orontes watershed in southeastern Turkey and northwest Syria. Over a century and a half of archaeological survey and excavation throughout this region has brought to light one of the most important cultural sequences in the ancient Near East. However, these initial projects represent diverse data sets of not only archaeological data, but excavation and recording methodologies, different taxonomies for the collected data, in which the level of detail and quality of the data varies greatly within the individual projects, let alone between projects. The diversity in language is also apparent as we are dealing with data in at least 7 different languages. The Online Cultural Heritage Environment, or OCHR, Heritage Research Environment, or OCHR, forms the core ontology deployed in the CRANE initiative. Its key feature is its flexibility, as relatively few concepts and relationships are predefined in OCHR. The OCHR ontology permits researchers to construct their own lists and hierarchies of data items and their own taxonomies to describe those items, allowing researchers to integrate their data and conduct detailed cross-project comparisons and analyses. Data from our initial projects continue to be integrated into our ever-expanding database, with new projects expanding our geographical reach. Key to the integration process is the involvement of both undergraduate and graduate students. The bulk of the data integration has been conducted in the computer lab at the University of Toronto in consultation with the OCHR database team in Chicago, composed of Sandy Sloan and Miller Prosser. At least 25 students have been hired through the work-study program or as research assistants, with close to 10,000 hours invested into the integration process by our dedicated team. The types of resources linked specifically to the data within OCHR are wide in scope. For example, original field records, illustrations, and photos, as well as GIS shapefiles. To date, nearly 123,000 resources are part of the ever-expanding dataset. Sites currently in the database initially started off as dots on published survey maps. As not all maps are equal and some are imprecise, we track down all catalog sites and confirm their actual location through modern satellite images available through Google Earth, historical corona images, and 30-meter raster and topographical maps. Visual identification of sites allow us to identify redundancies, namely sites that appear in numerous surveys, but whose original map location may not precisely overlap. Using OCHR artifacts can be queried. Showing object images along with various attributes such as metrics, typology, and fabric. For excavation data, loci can be highlighted within the established hierarchy, as you can see on the left, with details of the locus indicated in the properties. Locus sheets and top plans can be consulted, and field photos have hotspots linking directly to the details of all loci in that image. Of the nearly 16,000 trench photos linked to the database, our team has created hotspots for approximately 75% of these. More detailed information related to pales within loci are shown here, indicated that there are 3 objects, 1 sample and a flotation sample linked to pale 112. By highlighting object 2617, we can see not only the specific details of that object, but also any related illustrations or photos. More detailed information related to pales within loci are shown here, indicated that there are 3 objects, 1 sample and a flotation sample linked to pale 112. By highlighting object 26117, we can not only see the specific details of that object, but also any related illustrations or photos. Data integration efforts of various projects within Crane Project are not restricted to recent excavation projects, but include legacy data as well. A good example can be taken from the Syrian Hittite expedition conducted between 1932 and 1938. The Bronze and Iron Age history of the Amuk Plain region is dominated by the 2 primary sites in the plain, Tel Tayinat and Tel Echana, the capital of the Kingdom of Mukish, which was occupied in the Middle and Late Bronze Age. These sites are both located along the southern edge of the valley, where the Orontes River begins to turn westwards towards the outlet into the Mediterranean, approximately 22 kilometers from the modern city of Antakya, which was ancient Antioch. Tayinat was occupied during the early Bronze Age, the late 4th and 3rd millennium BC, with occupation shifting to Tel Echana for the Middle and Late Bronze Ages. Settlement moves back to Tayinat again during the Iron 1 period, and it remains there throughout the Iron Age from about 1200 BC to 600 BC. Tel Tayinat was originally excavated in the 1930s by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago. Although initial publication of the Syrian Hittite expedition appeared in 1970, it only produced a brief description of the architecture from the principal Iron Age strata uncovered at the site of Tel Tayinat. The remarkably rich assemblage of associated material culture was not treated, and the lack of a detailed final report represented a significant impediment to an understanding of the historical development of this period. Dr. Heather Snow is currently working on the publication of this material and has been allowed access to the original notebooks, letters, plans, sketches, and photo negatives, all of which have been scanned. Over the years, the Tayinat collection in the OI, as well as the Antaki Museum, have been photographed and drawn, and additional early Bronze Age pottery in the collections of the OI have been drawn by Dr. Lynn Welton. Heather has undertaken the arduous task of meticulously re-evaluating the stratigraphy based on the original notes, a difficult task considering the often confusing recording system where the nomenclature of excavation areas constantly changed, all of which were never recorded in plan form. Heather, with the assistance of Stephen Batchek, Dr. Stephen Batchek, built the spatial hierarchy of the excavations, a process starting with establishing building or trench numbers and then subdivisions of rooms within these buildings into which objects and pottery were placed. Periodization or building periods were also added in which all resources could be linked, which then allowed the importation of 3,502 objects, of which 2,935 had established spatial data. The early development of an object database, which included objects with their descriptions and locations, allowed the integration of this data into Ochre, and eventually led to the point provenience of the vast majority of the 3,500 registered objects, along with nearly 4,000 registered Iron Age sherds from the database created by Dr. James Osborne. With a better understanding of the stratigraphy and placement of artifacts, the project now has the ability to query artifacts by period or any other descriptor in the database.
The Tayinat Archaeological Project of the University of Toronto began our excavations in 2004 under the direction of Tim Harrison, and we started excavating in an area known as Field 1, which is located here in the central part of the Tell. Nearly 20 years later, it's in this area that we've encountered levels dating to the 3rd millennium BC, and the earliest levels we've reached so far represent a significant architectural phase that represents parts of 2 apparently separate but adjacent buildings. At least one of these buildings appears to have been heavily burnt, and you can see the remains of the burnt architectural walls here in the images. The date of these structures is not yet certain because we don't have radiocarbon dates conducted yet from these levels, but preliminary results based on the pottery suggest that it may date to sometime in the mid-3rd millennium BC. The remains of the following level, which are represented here in gray, are also a major architectural phase, again dating to the late 3rd millennium BC, with walls preserved to a height of more than 1.5 meters and floors covered in smashed ceramics, as well as the associated debris from the destruction of these buildings. After the destruction of this architecture, there's a short period of ephemeral occupation at the site that consists mostly of pits before the site is abandoned, and toward the end of the 3rd millennium, the occupation shifts to the site of Tel Echana. Tayinat is reoccupied again sometime in the middle of the 12th century BC, with a settlement that is first characterized by continuity in ceramic traditions from those that are used in the late Bronze Age, with increasing numbers of painted Aegeanizing ceramics as we move into the 11th century BC. The appearance of these types of ceramics is often assumed to be linked to the movements of the Sea Peoples, who are usually described as being responsible for the widespread disruption that occurs throughout the Mediterranean world at the end of the late Bronze Age. Our excavations at Tayinat, however, show evidence for substantial continuity despite the introduction of some Aegeanizing elements. We also know something more about this period historically from excavations on the citadel in Aleppo, which exposed the remains of a temple to the storm god, that includes an inscription in hieroglyphic Luvian mentioning a king called Tayta, who is the king of a kingdom known as Palestine. And this inscription is believed to date to the 11th century. Other references to the same kingdom have been found in several other locations, and most reconstructions favor the idea that this kingdom, Palestine, which you can see illustrated on the map here, should be located in the Amuk, and the most likely capital of this kingdom should be located at Tel Tayinat. As we continue through the Iron Age, Tayinat grows into a major Neo-Hittite center known as Kunalua, the seat of a powerful regional state, and that's called variously Patina or Unki. And as Stan already mentioned, the excavations from the 1930s uncovered a series of very significant palace and temple structures in the main part of the site. These structures recount the occupation at Tayinat during the late 10th through the 8th centuries BC. Both the 1930s excavations and our excavations have uncovered a variety of inscriptions in hieroglyphic Luvian, which help to reconstruct the site's history, including the names of several rulers. And these inscriptional materials are studied by Luvian specialist Mark Whedon. More recently, our excavations have uncovered a series of impressive sculptures, including a completely intact seated lion and 2 human sculptures, one of which we can identify as King Shupaluliyuma, due to a Luvian inscription on his back, and one which represents an as yet unidentified female. All of these sculptures come from a single, relatively small area located just to the east of Field 1. The excavations are still clarifying the stratigraphy in this area, but it is possible that this area may have been some kind of gate complex. The site was then conquered by the Assyrians, by Tiglath-Pileser III around 738 BC, after which it became a province in the Assyrian administrative empire known as Kulani or Kinalia. Dating to the Assyrian period is another significant discovery from our excavations, which is a temple we call Temple 16. The temple itself actually predates the Assyrian conquest at the site, but it was reused during the Assyrian period and was eventually burned in a violent destruction. All of the items that were found inside the temple therefore date to the time of its destruction. This includes a large cuneiform tablet identified by our Assyriologist Jake Lowinger as a succession treaty of the Assyrian king Esarhaddon, which tells us the temple must have been destroyed sometime after 672 BC. One of Crane's major initiatives is headed by Stuart Manning of Cornell University, working with Britta Lorentzen, which has involved the creation of a robust, high-resolution, absolute timescale for the Orontes watershed, with a particular emphasis on the Bronze and Iron Ages. By analyzing radiocarbon samples from sites like Tayinat, Zinjerli, Tel Nebi-Mend, and Tel Karkur, and then modeling these dates to incorporate stratigraphic information in a way that helps us constrain the date ranges obtained from the individual samples. And this has helped us to clarify the chronology of the early Bronze Age and the early Iron Age levels at Tayinat by modeling a series of 49 radiocarbon dates. In particular, these dates have helped us to solidify the chronology for the Iron Age occupation of the site prior to the Assyrian conquest, We're continuing with radiocarbon dating of the iron 3 levels from the site, which we hope will give us a better sense of the chronology of the latest periods of Tayinat's occupation. One of the most challenging projects we've been working on relates to the sculptural fragments that we've recovered from this possible gate complex. Associated with all of these sculptures are thousands and thousands of fragments of basalt that represent pieces of either sculptures we've already found, such as the female sculpture who we've been calling the Lady of Tayinat, whose face and body had been severely defaced in antiquity, or possibly from other sculptures we haven't identified yet. Our aim is to be able to better reconstruct these statues, and a team that's working under the direction of our conservator, Julie Unruh, has been working to manually find joins between these fragments. So far, they've been very successful in finding a number of joins, but given the number of fragments, which you can get a sense of from the photographs on the slide, this is obviously a gigantic undertaking. So as a result, we've started investigating other methods that will potentially help with this reconstruction effort. For example, building on projects that have looked into automated computer-aided lithic refitting, we've been exploring the possibility of using three-dimensional shape matching algorithms as a way to piece these fragments together. And these investigations are still at a very preliminary stage. But as part of this effort, we've started making 3D models of all of the basalt sculptures and fragments from our excavations at Tayinat. This past summer, we also began a pilot project to use chemical signatures from the basalt fragments to help us identify which sculptures they came from, using portable X-ray fluorescence to characterize their individual signatures. And our collaborator, Aaron Sugar, is working on analyzing that data currently.
Public outreach is an important aspect of the Crane project and has been part of our mission since the beginning. Crane maintains a close relationship with the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, which has allowed us to reach a much wider audience. Through some of the ROM's programs, Crane has participated in various events interacting with the public. Crane staff also worked directly with the school groups in classroom settings, exposing them to the world of Near Eastern archaeology. In an effort to be more interactive with the younger audience and create detailed architectural features for virtual or augmented reality, Crane has applied various 3D reconstructions of ancient architecture. Examples are a rendition of Zingerle in SketchUp, along with more realistic depictions of lower townhouses using Maya, and a reconstruction of the interior of Temple 16 at Tayinat. Stephen Batchik and Dominique Langhi-Brassetti have imported the topographical terrain around Tayinat using freeware and populated the region with fields of wheat, a vineyard, an olive grove, the village reconstructed in SketchUp, and some fig and laurel trees around the houses, and finally covering the surrounding hillside with oak and Aleppo pine. The end result is an incredibly realistic landscape that can be portrayed completely with varieties of vegetation into which the architecture can be placed, providing a realistic and immersive environment that can be explored in first person. Although these gaming engines produce a more realistic view of the ancient world, we have found a more educational approach in the use of Minecraft. Although the graphics may not be as realistic as other gaming software, the simplistic, blocky landscapes have not changed radically since the game's release, and incorporating and building these environments in this simple but powerful gaming platform are relatively straightforward. As options are limited and accepted as such, we do not have to obsess with the tiniest details. The first step of the project will be to recreate the Iron Age mounds of Tel Tayinat and Tel Echana in the Amuk as faithfully as possible. Once completed, we hope to move on to other sites such as Carchemish. All the interaction in the game will take place through a varied cast of NPCs specifically designated for our purpose. Dialogue options can be implemented, which will convey most of the information and instructions. Some of the characters already developed for Tayinat are, of course, King Shupiliuma, scribes, soldiers, and of course, the Lady of Tayinat. In creating the Tayinat Minecraft world, we are attempting to maintain the architectural features focusing on the Iron 2 and 3 periods, approximately 1000 to 600 BCE, utilizing the data from the various archaeological projects. Many Tayinat administrative buildings have been created, such as those surrounding Courtyard 8, both during the day and at night. Now, it's important to create the Minecraft world as accurately as possible based on the archaeological evidence. Part of our coring work conducted during the 2004-2005 seasons have greatly assisted in our understanding of the ancient terrain around the site of Tel Tayinat. Evident today is the twisting Orontes River near the site as seen in the image on the left. The change in the river system through time appears in the relic river channels evident in the corona image, as well as the noticeable outline of the lower city buried beneath meters of alluvial sediment. Coring across and around the tell produced variability in the cores extracted, as visible in the cores across section A to A prime. Material culture in pink was only evident in the core from the tell itself, with primarily variegated alluvial sediments and clays occurring off the tell during the Iron Age. These results reinforce the depiction of Tayinat on the Balawat Gate, where waters appear in front of the gates of the city. The coring results would suggest Tayinat was perhaps surrounded by water, or at least a marshy landscape of the Orontes river system during the 9th century, as portrayed in our reconstruction on the left. For this reason, a marshy landscape is depicted in front of the Minecraft gates of Tayinat, which will eventually contain water. The somewhat more difficult to interpret is the construction of the interior of the buildings on the site. However, with our recent work on the artifact distribution from the 1930s excavations, determination of activity areas through the cluster of artifacts may aid in our interpretation. A recent crane sub-project conducted by the Turco-Italian archaeological expedition at Carchemish uses photogrammetry and laser scanners to produce 3D models for documentation and study purposes of archaeological materials and contexts. The project focuses on the buildings and artifacts of the so-called Lower Palace area during its most monumental phase, dated between the 10th and 8th centuries BC. By launching an application on one's own device, virtual visitors are able to walk around the Lower Palace area model, elaborated from pictures taken from a drone, turning on and off the virtually reintegrated decorated orthostat models excavated by the earlier British Museum campaigns, with the possibility to inspect them for more information and visual details about that particular artifact.
Another significant component of Crane's long-term research agenda relates to a series of interrelated research projects that aim to develop a framework within which to interpret human-environment interaction and responses to past climate variability in the Middle East. The first of these sub-projects is a program of climate modeling that's directed by Dick Peltier in the University of Toronto's Physics Department, working with postdoc Deepak Chandan. And this involves the use of global climate models, or GCMs, which are also now quite frequently called Earth system models. And these are one of the most important current mechanisms for examining the potential future environmental impacts of climate change. They're used by the International Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, to predict likely future outcomes. And increasingly, these kinds of models are also being used to examine climate patterns in the past. And as such, they're starting to be more enthusiastically embraced in archaeology. These models use current knowledge of the underlying physics of climate processes to simulate global changes in the environment by combining models of the atmosphere, oceans, land surface, and sea ice. The link between climate variability and its impact on past agricultural productivity is also critical, and one of our primary concerns is therefore how substantially crop growth might have been impacted by changes in temperature and precipitation, and by variability in the frequency of drought conditions. So this is the focus of an ongoing research project to examine and compare different forms of evidence for ancient agricultural productivity. These kinds of estimates of agricultural productivity, which are informed by climate data, can provide us with a series of realistic scenarios that we can use as examples for models that examine how human populations might have perceived and responded to these changes, and what impacts that may have had on their society. To address this, another of Crane's sub-projects focuses on another kind of computational modeling, known as agent-based modeling, and how this can help us to examine the impacts of these kinds of environmental scenarios and possible responses to them. Agent-based modeling is a technique that's used to examine complex systems by creating a virtual world and then programming the actions of individuals that exist in this virtual world. These individuals are called agents, and they perform their actions in a sequence at every different time step of a simulation that we perform, which is run for hundreds of steps. The underlying basis for Crane's agent-based model has two main parts. The first relates to demography, which treats the population dynamics of individual people as realistically as we can approximate, using data from ancient textual sources. These individuals form households that we believe to be common from ancient texts, and then these households represent the primary decision-making agent for the second part of the model, which is a detailed agricultural model simulating the annual agricultural cycle. At each time step, households make decisions and perform the actions that are necessary to grow crops in their fields. And we try to ensure that this is realistic according to what we know from ancient texts, and also incorporates potential variations in agricultural practices. The model is aimed at specifically simulating agriculture that occurs in the dry farming environments that are typical of northern Mesopotamia. And it currently includes a representation of how cultivated area expands over time based on an idealized Bronze Age site using the model of land use that was developed by Tony Wilkinson for the dry farming areas of northern Syria. The model acts as a kind of laboratory, allowing us to test the impacts of various scenarios on population dynamics, such as short-term crop failures and the impact of unpredictable year-to-year variation in agricultural yields, as well as different strategies relating to risk management. Systematically testing these scenarios allows us to examine how various competing factors determine the outcomes of these scenarios, both in terms of the impact they have on the population dynamics, but also tracking the impact on patterns of land use. And ultimately, this gives us a better idea how climate variability and different agricultural strategies can interact to create larger patterns of land use at the community level. The strategies we're testing using agent-based modeling can also have environmental impacts, and they potentially have repercussions for local or regional climate. In fact, the climate models, like the ones I mentioned a minute ago, have been demonstrated to be sensitive to input data related to human land use. So there's a pressing need for reconstructions of land use that are based on archaeological data from this region. And this is exactly the goal of a project called Land Cover 6K, which is aiming to produce global data for various time periods in the past for both land cover and land use as a means of providing data to climate modelers to allow testing of the human impacts on past climate. And this project is divided into various global subregions, and Crane is collaborating in the Middle East group. Finally, as we move into the final publication phase of Crane, a significant question that we've been grappling with relates to the issue of longer-term data preservation and data stewardship. Working in an agreement with the University of Toronto Library System, which is one of the largest libraries in North America, and which has as one of its core mandates acting as a permanent repository and steward of data across all the different kinds of computing platforms as they continue to evolve, and then preserving that data in perpetuity. So the image in this slide just shows an example of some of the first test cases we've been working with to try and ingest the data into the University of Toronto Library System's storage facilities. And this is an example of data from excavations from the site of Télécharnay, a project that was directed by Michel Fortin of Université Laval. And that concludes our talk. I'd just like to very quickly thank all of the members of the Tayinat Archaeological Project, as well as the members of the Crane Research Project. And also thank you to everyone who's here today to listen to us talk. Thank you very much.